Well, everything I know about open innovation will take about 2 minutes, but I'll try and spin it out. Pierre, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. One of the things that you missed on the introduction was I was fortunate enough to be invited by the Commission to chair the first ever panel thinking about what's the economic and what's the socio-economic model for investing in this joint undertaking. So IMI is something that's been dear to my heart since before IMI 1. And in coming and making my comments today, I have been reflecting on the conversations that we had way back then when the Commission and the FPL were looking at setting this fantastic undertaking up. And I have asked myself repeatedly, well, have we actually been able to deliver on IMI what the first vision was? And are we sufficiently agile, evolutionary, experimental to deliver on this great enterprise? And that's going to be the theme of my comments this morning. Before I get into it, though, Pierre, it amazes me that this is the 9th anniversary. I just want to say that you don't have to wait for the 10th to have a party. Okay. Right, so I spent a long time in the OECD, and now back in academia, I like data. So you're going to get a fair amount of data here. And this is probably the best thing that came out of the OECD in all the time that I was there on why innovation matters. And that's what I want to start with. Why does innovation matter? And why do we want to make more innovative our medicines enterprise? This is great data. I can't think of a single country that went through the economic crash and didn't use this data set to justify why money should continue to be spent on public science and innovation. What it does is it shows what's been driving the performance of a number of very, very high-performing economies. And the important bit for us is the kind of the brick red, multifactor productivity. And the economists in the audience can give you a 5-day lecture on what multifactor productivity means. But here what we're talking about is a proxy for innovation. And it's about the best proxy for innovation that we've got. Innovation is an intangible capital, ideas, intellectual assets, brilliant new proposals. That's what's been driving economies. And that's what continues to drive economies. And as I say, this was the data set. I've seen it in Chinese publications, in US ones, in UK ones, in German ones. Across the board, the high-performing economies have said, yeah, all right, we get it. Investing in science matters. And it matters even more when you start to ask, well, what are the differences between the really high-performing economies and those economies that are growing? Now, this data is a little bit old. So it's based on the data up to 2005. And the numbers, of course, will be very different now, with China at 6.9% growth declared this morning in the party conference, second largest economy in the world, a sleeping giant which is beginning to awaken but still got a long way to go. What this data shows you, if you look at the red circle there, is here I'm making things confusing for you. I'm now talking about total factor rather than multi-factor productivity. But it's a dimension of that same thing. It's what is it that's driving productivity? It's the innovation, and it's innovation that makes the big difference in terms of the really top economies and those that have still got ways to go. Think about China. Think about China. Look, total factor productivity, 13 against an index of 100 in the US. The US as being the innovative pinnacle in this table. My goodness me. If China gets to near 100, what are they going to achieve? So innovation matters. It's a bunch of economists, and I'm a microbiologist, thank you, Pierre. But I spent 10 years with 2,000 economists. But I've recovered, I've only got one small department now. But the economists will think about, well, how do we address these productivity gaps? That's the graph on the right-hand side. And as we know, in our area, productivity is a challenge. Productivity is a challenge in terms of the amount of money, the amount of effort that's spent on trying to develop and bring new medicines to the market. And everybody in this room can recite 20 reasons for why that's the case. And everybody in this room understands that the productivity challenge is harder because disease targets are more complex, because attrition rates are higher, because quite rightly regulators are very, very, very determined to assure patient safety. But innovation should be able to deliver and restore productivity growth. And if we look back to the Lisbon Summit, that was certainly the position taken by the Commission then. And throughout the last few years in my own country, the UK, with the launch of the idea of industrial strategy, that innovation driving growth is still at the core. Why are we innovating? Well, we're not just innovating to get rich, or at least I'm an academic, I'm not. We're innovating because what we want is to make differences to lives. And here is just a snapshot from WHO of infectious diseases globally. This was when we were doing a piece of work around disease, neglected and emerging infectious diseases, working with WHO, with FPR, with many people in this room to look at how could we come together and create more experimental, more agile models to address infectious diseases. We could put up dozens and dozens and dozens and hundreds of view graphs that show where the health burden continues to be for us. And it's changing fast. And frankly, it's difficult to predict exactly what the big breakthroughs and what the challenges will be 5, 10, 20 years from now. So I've talked about innovation and why it's important. Let me talk a bit about the whole idea of public-private partnerships, why they matter, why they are actually essential. They've always been there one way or another within the health field, within the biomedicine field. Biomedicine, biotechnology, pharmaceuticals are highly reliant on work that's done, funded by the public purse in the public sector, in universities, in hospitals, around beyond just the private sector entities, whether they be small entities, medium entities, or large entities. If we look at where patents are, and I accept, this is a problem I have in my university, the push towards universities patenting does mean we've got some patents that aren't actually worth much, and I would like to think, and my industry colleagues tell me to do, that their management of patent portfolios is more rigorous than in the public sector. But nevertheless, this is a real partnership between research, between innovation across our sectors, and it always has been. We haven't needed public-private partnerships of the sort that IMI is to say, well, it is a partnership. But this is a challenge. This is a challenge because if we look at where the money is going, I do sound like an economist, don't I? But I really am a microbiologist. If we look at where the money is going, we in Europe are still lagging in terms of research intensity, so the proportion of our GDP that we actually spend on research. And as you can see here, China's now overtaken us. And my God, they have a lot of GDP. And it's almost 7% growth. That's really climbing very quickly. So public research does matter. It is absolutely crucial to our joint enterprise. It's particularly crucial to our joint enterprise because it's not just productivity challenges to bring in new medicines to the market. There's also huge cost challenges, and it's a challenge in itself estimating what these are. And here's just a couple that I've picked. One from Tufts, which is kind of the global figure, and one from the Office of Health Economics, which is more the actual specific figure on direct spend. And I'm sure Natalie has 25 different numbers coming at her on this from different places. And I'm not going to die in a ditch over these numbers, but they're big. They're big, and it's a tough enterprise. So what public-private partnerships have been trying to do for a long time now is formalize that coming together, address the so-called valley of the death, take that public science and link it up with private science and with private enterprise and deliver pull-through. And we can argue about how effectively we've created that bridge over the valley of the death. But for many public-private partnerships, certainly in our space, that absolutely is a core rationale for those holding the purse strings to release money to move us forward. This is an old slide. It's a linear model of innovation, discovery, development, and delivery. And I sometimes stop there. I did a piece of work in the OECD a few years ago where we looked at the extent to which countries had linked up their policies for promoting technology push in biomedicine with actual demand pool. And the short answer was they were all good at doing that, and only 1 out of 13 countries we looked at thought about that last part, diffusion in as well. And I don't want to get into the reasons for that now, but involving those patients, health services, clinicians in the decision-making on what's actually funded it's just been necessary for such a long time, but in so many partnerships that we see today, it's still quite suboptimal. And I came up with this virtuous cycle of innovation, and I know people say that imitation is the greatest form of flattery, and everywhere I go now I get told that, if only you understood, Iain, it's the virtuous cycle of innovation that you require, and I think, yeah, absolutely. And my virtuous cycle of innovation is truly interconnected and works in all directions and is about true partnership and true experimentation. I think we're still a bit away from that. Pierre asked me to talk about open innovation. This is the classic model of open innovation. It's all about firm-level boundaries. You can put it into Google and you'll see 45 different versions of this funnel. I think personally this is still a very linear model, but that is the classic model of open innovation. I prefer this one. The key thing, proudly found elsewhere. It is about embracing different approaches, working together, taking risks, internalizing and externalizing, so an internal open innovation, external open innovation, and moving away from let's do everything ourselves. Frankly, the pharmaceutical industry has been pursuing some elements of open innovation for some time. But if I was to ask myself the question, is there a model of open innovation across pharma, across biomedicine? No, there are countless ones. And still, for me, that model I showed before of that kind of linear approach with open bits at the margins is a better characterization of what's happening than that true virtuous cycle. All right, that's as much as you're going to get to theory. And now let's talk about what's actually happening. I love this cartoon. As you can see, I stole it from the web, which is why it's a bit fuzzy. But I just love the concept of, well, let's just knock holes in things. Let's just take risks. If we're really going to do open innovation, let's do it. Let's actually create some real steam. And there's a lot around. There's a lot of these knowledge markets, PPPs around. Here's a slide from almost 10 years ago now, starting to define what some of these PPPs are about, what some of these different consortia are around. You can see some are academic-led, still are. Some are led by the regulators, still the case, struggling. Some led by governments, or at least in this case, the Commission plus stakeholders plus FPA, IMI, still the biggest. Some by industry specifically, and a small number, which are cross-sectoral. I put this slide up because I want to just get people to realize the journey we've come on. So this is a slide from 2008. And it talks about less than 10 pharmaceutical consortia existing at the beginning of the 2000s. And then it talks about 1.7 million hits on Google on pharmaceutical consortia. And then the number of consortia that are focused around discovery and the value of them. And at the time, this was staggeringly impressive. Wow, is the world changing? Let's just look at some of these today. Pharmaceutical consortia. It's not really the way we talk about PPPs and innovative. It's a bit old speak. So I searched Google this morning and just asked myself, how many hits do I think I'm going to get in pharmaceutical consortia? Guesses? It's old speak, we don't talk about that. 25 million. I didn't look for other things. If we look at the literature around open innovation, pharmaceutical consortia, opening up the kinds of things that we are trying to do in our joint endeavour. At one point, there were a few people writing in this. Then we've got departments doing it. We look at the value. Well, more than 1 billion annual budget for major consortia. That's a third of your budget, Pierre, not even. So we really shifted, really changed in terms of how we come together and drive that innovation direction. CPATH's model, many of you know, some of you are involved in it. It was an early model. It tries to include everybody and still makes a lot of progress, but it's at the moment very US focused. So how does that model break out internationally and have real reach? The IMI model, this is IMI 1. Not much has really changed. Pierre would argue it's evolved, and he's right, it has evolved, thanks to all of you, but we still have the same governance model, more or less, with a bit of tinkering at the edges. The numbers have gone up, there's a lot of projects, and there's some fantastic science and great delivery, but we still have that rather, I would say, as an academic, old-fashioned governance model. That's not the case for all. Structural Genomics Consortium, well, everybody in the room knows what the Structural Genomics Consortium does. Look at the range of funders, look at the openness of the system, look at the number of leads that it's created. Structural Genomics Consortium has been and continues to be a really great success. It's much more agile than some of the PPPs around. And we're seeing PPPs growing up which look rather repetitive. So here's one, it's a European-focused one. I'm sure many of you here are involved in it. It's about AMR. AMR is one of the big challenges around that everyone is piling money into. But if one asks the question, are they really well linked up? I think the answer is not really. So here's another one. This is a more US-focused one. Wellcome put a lot more money into this than the previous one. Now, how will they find their comparative niches? How will they work together? How will they do what Pierre suggested? Actually focus on spending that money and that effort and that intellectual capacity on added value rather than some repetition. Many of us sit on grant review panels, and many of us will see grants coming before us for quite large numbers, where you think, well, actually, that's been done in a different part of the world a couple of years ago with a bigger cohort, and if you do this, all that's going to happen is you'll have a less well-powered piece of work to come up with the same conclusions we've done before. So how do we actually create, for these big, expensive pieces of work, how do we create that more global community to deliver on our joint enterprise? And we're seeing disruption. As Pierre said, digital industry is much more involved now than was the case 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And we have even larger ones like AstraZeneca, together with Microsoft, creating real new partnerships. So are we in our PPPs, in IMI, for example, are we able to be agile and flexible enough to bring in these different players with different business models to deliver on our goals? There are some small disruptors around. I grabbed these two from the new UK life sciences sector plan. As you may or may not know, the UK has put quite a lot of money into this industrial strategy, and it's asking sectors to come up with what would you spend it on. And this John Bell led the sector plan for life sciences, the first one to be delivered, and I'm going to come back to that in my black ringed slides at the end. But these are much more agile, much more multi-partner PPPs, bringing in SMEs together with universities, together with government funders, together with health service deliverers. Not so much at the moment large companies, and I think these are skewed in a way that some of the others are skewed in a different direction. I want to, for the last few minutes, if I may, switch from, well, that's what some of the things that are happening. So we have, as Pierre was talking in his introductory remarks, much more technology integration, or at least the determination to do it. New players like Amazon, like Google, like Microsoft, like GE, pulling together the imaging plus data analytics plus cloud computing into the enterprise of how do we actually drive productivity through the IMI focus. But we continually ask companies who at the end of the day exist to provide a return on investment to their shareholders. We continually ask them to put more money in. Money attracts money. That's a good thing and a bad thing. This is a shift in the UK funding profile since an extra $2 billion a year has been pumped into this industrial strategy. As you can see, what it's trying to do is address the middle ground. Again, it's a different way of thinking about the value of the death. And if we ask how the funding environment has changed, and this is the case in the UK, this has been the case with a lot of the thinking around Horizon 20, it's very much the case in a whole range of countries in Europe and elsewhere. It is tying expenditure to innovation, productivity and growth, do bigger, more cross-institutional things, more interdisciplinary things, focus more on that downstream translation. It's easy to spend money on research, but turning research into money is much harder. So how do you do that? How do you drive growth and productivity? Coming back to these questions at the beginning. And you might look at these and go, well, it's fantastic. It's fantastic because that's going to allow us to actually really drive more public money and private money together, really gel these partnerships and really step up a step. And that's certainly what ministers in various countries are hoping for. But unlike the infographic, money doesn't grow on trees. And one of the big challenges is becoming, for me, as an academic, looking at pulling things together with my colleagues in universities, for others too, how do we match up resources? There's more and more and more demand for match. And more demand for, well, look, we, the public sector, will put cash in industry. Why don't you put some cash in too and match it? And that's tough unless we actually do things which we have real focus and capability and capacity to deliver on. And it misses the point on something that was there at the very beginning of thinking about these knowledge markets in this open innovation paradigm. Again, this takes us back 10 years. And it's part of the underpinning of why we talked about establishing IMI and establishing a whole range of these other partnerships. It's about unlocking a lot of that underutilized knowledge. And you can read this as well as I can, and you can read it, and a lot of this will be familiar. But one of the challenges in match, the way that many of us have thought about match, and I've been a funder myself, is that match has to be something new. So pulling resources together, well, I'll put something in if you put something in, but it all has to be part of what we do in the future. Rather than actually what we really want to do is use the assets, the intellectual assets we've got, And we can use some of the intellectual assets that have been around for quite a long time in new ways that we could never have imagined doing 5 or 10 years ago. Why would we not want to do that? But we need agility and experimentation that allows us to really build on the basis of knowledge. It's not all about new things. A lot of this is about innovating the way we use things, the way we do things. Picking up on a few of the items, and I'll close in a few slides if I may, around looking at the IMI model. As I say, I wanted to come back to that after having been involved from day one. I worry about governance. I really do worry about governance. And it is something that's evolved a lot in IMI, and it's something which I think 90% of the time works actually pretty well. And I was really interested to see this, the development of associated partners. And I thought, well, I wonder who they are. And I was a bit surprised that it's a very short list. Now, one wouldn't look at any of these and think, oh, that's shabby. You look at that list and think, oh, that's fantastic. It's wonderful, these organizations that are involved. Although many of them are only involved in really quite small sections of work. But there are not many. You don't have disruptive organizations from different technologies that are able to come in and pull together new knowledge, cloud computing, engineering, what have you, in there. And I don't know the answer why that is. I don't know if it's about the cost. I can't imagine it is, because the cost isn't that high compared to other areas. I don't know if it's about a feeling of a closed shop. I just can't answer that because I'm not close enough to this. But I do worry that the governance model isn't actually pulling in the partners that will deliver success in our new world of information-enabled technology. And PR talked about these earlier, let me not dwell on this, around imaging, around new engineering solutions, cloud computing solutions. Google it, it's all over the place. There's fantastic things going on. I get really jazzed when I get folk from Telefonica and from Microsoft and from Google and from Amazon in and out of our office. And it's not just about our space work. It is about what are we doing in cardiovascular disease, what are we doing in diabetes and beyond. Where are they in our partnerships? What's the impact that we're delivering? And again, I feel challenged by this. Pierre first brought me in to the Genome Canada peer review process, and he said, Iain, what I want you to do is think about impact. Don't worry too much about the genomics. I've got thousands of great genomics scientists, well, hundreds anyway, that I can involve in this. But I'm going to ask the question, is this actually worth it? Is this going to deliver something that's going to change? And I said, well, what do you mean by change, PR? And he said, what do you mean by change? I said, well, it's about health. Will what we do and what we fund actually change our ability to deliver better health to patients and better living standards to their family and create commercial opportunities and grow our economy? You've got to do both. So are we thinking about this enough from a perspective of judging where the money goes? Pierre was telling me that in IMI2, we've already funded 30 big projects, Pierre. And I think you said the mean size of them was around 30 million euros. And some are really mega projects. Well, my question is, well, are they actually going to deliver on health to people? Because that is what we're in this for. It's about people. They're the market. They are the reason that we are allowed to do what it is we do. Are they actually sufficiently involved in decision-making around programming, around evaluation, peer review of projects? And have we got enough social science involved in here so that what's being delivered through the projects is actually landed and actually is translated into better health outcomes? Because widgets are great, but if the patient's not going to use them, one of the big issues I had when I was in the UK Department of Health was around cost of pharma products And actually, the biggest waste of cost was the fact we had 45% patient concordance across proprietary medicines. We talk about IP, just a couple of slides more. You went on for a long time. That's why I'm late. I timed you. IP. Oh, my God, the amount of time that we've all spent thinking about intellectual property. Again, if I look back to the beginning of IMI, what we talked about was collaborative ways to think about IP. It was the great days of the Lambert agreements, about the very first creation of patent pools, about thinking about patent clearinghouses. I pulled together a meeting with Wellcome in Washington, D.C. And it was essentially folk from the pharma industry, plus the big charities, plus those responsible for antitrust legislation in North America and in Europe, both officials and the judiciary. And we had a conversation about where the borderline lies on what's pre-competitive. And the folk from the biomedicine came in and really felt they were pushing at the borders, pushing at the boundaries. And the judiciary sat there and said, it's okay, it's fine, it's fine. When are you going to tell us something that's going to make us worry? And we said, well, what do you mean by that? Well, actually, what you're trying to do around some of these collaborations is actually quite far away from what we would think about as being an antitrust case or collusion. And it was a moment of epiphany where the judiciary had moved on. And at that point, those interested in biomedicine hadn't quite understood how far it moved on. And I wonder here, around IP, as we pull in different actors with different IP models, with different requirements, whether what we have now around background, sideground IP in the way that we implement IMI agreements actually is experimental and agile enough to pick up with where some other players are. I think my final comments are around internationalisation. Europe can't do this alone. Actually, I took that from a slide that I gave to an innovative medicines conference here in Brussels about 5 years ago, and I'm finding I'm saying the same thing. It's fantastic that now the Commissioner talks about vision for Europe with the 3 O's: open innovation, open science, open to the world. It's wonderful. But we need to see that that turns into what IMI does as well. Here's an infographic. It's an old one. The size of the bubble is the amount of science. The connection in between is the amount of co-publication. The key one, of course, as ever, is China. Look at the difference. But also India, Brazil. And this is tiny compared to what's happening now. I talked about China as a sleeping giant. Well, R&D as percent of GDP, China has already gone that way. You were looking at that earlier in an earlier slide. The proportion of population involved is tiny, but look at the size, the outputs. Outputs are going up, quality is going up. Today, just in The Guardian, there was a great article about universities actually moving towards Chinese-led research rather than Chinese following research. We all face this. Are we engaged with them? Are we doing things together? Are we actually collaborating across borders in the US, Canada, China, beyond? This is my penultimate slide. It's my black rim slide. I live in and come from a country that's done something very, very, very stupid indeed. And I continue to hope and lobby with all my heart that before we do something really, really, really stupid, we change our mind. But I'm not going to counter it. But I show these quotes because they've come from this life science sector deal that I talked about just a few minutes ago that was launched a couple of weeks ago. UK is thinking about how departure from the EU might allow itself more agility. Now, personally, I think that's emperor's clothes. Personally, I think the UK is so linked in to what's happening in Europe, the degrees of freedom it will get for agility will be tiny, and they'll be more than drowned by the negatives. But the fact that we're thinking about agility suggests that actually we do need to think about flexibilities and agility here in our joint European enterprise. And the last quote there is about disruption, is about taking risks. Moonshot DARPA type work. Should we be doing really, really big, really great things together and accepting that they might not all work? Will auditors go with that? And that feels to me a little bit like the conversation that we had all these years ago with the antitrust judiciary. I'm going to skip that one in the interest of time. So here's my list of issues that I would hope that people will be discussing here in the Stakeholder Forum over the next couple of days. I think they're on all your minds anyway. International partnership, we ought to be doing more together. Governance, I do think it feels clunky, it feels not fit for purpose any longer, insufficiently agile. Risk appetite. Let's take some risks. Let's take some risks and we'll get better returns and better rewards. Use all of our assets, not just the new ones we generate. We've got enough problems in our world without turning our back on half of the intellectual assets, actually far more than that we can do. Impact matters. Make sure patients actually are fully involved in things because it's all about the patients. Be agile, be experimental. And I think going forward, Pierre, when IMI 3 is launched, and I look forward to that party particularly, agility, I hope, is at its core. Thank you all very much.
Well, thanks very much, Iain, for that really interesting talk. Are there any show of hands if there are questions for Iain? We have 5 or 10 minutes for questions. I know I went on, it is my fault I went on far too long. Sorry. So there's one here, and then we have some questions from our web stream people. Will they come on the screen or? Yeah. So, but there's a question down here. Maybe wait for the microphone. Right, yeah.
Hello, my name is Inge Nilsen. I come from the university in the city of Tromsø, and also called as the Arctic University of Norway. One of the deliveries is, of course, depending on the projects, is depending on, are you producing pharmaceutical or are you producing public health? I think that one of the things missing here is what kind of level do you start looking at causes and multifactorial causes maybe. In that respect, I would like to promote our own population study. We have in the city more than 40,000 individuals have been followed since 1974, 7 rounds. 15,000 of them have been participating in 3 rounds of this study. We have a biobank of all these people. We have databases telling their clinical analysis, their own questionnaires where they have been talking about lifestyles, and we also have a full medical record. I think this is an asset for the big public health projects, also that should be of interest for the pharmaceutical industry. Thank you.
Thanks. You come from a beautiful city. You've just done a great advert for your work. So it's an asset. It's an asset we should build on. And I think that is a fundamental underlying message here.
So we have Saladin.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the impact and the way you measure impact. So the notion of time and the time scale here, because those big projects are not expected to deliver on a short period of time. This is most of the time largely unknown and underestimated. So did you have a look at that, for big projects, big consortia? We are not expecting a deliverable of a short term, 6 months, or it's rather over years, especially when you talk about people health and patients' impact.
So the view I've always brought is the notion of line of sight. So can I see that impact is achievable within a reasonable period from the end of a project? And one of the great things that IMI does is it funds for a long time. It can fund for a lot longer than the usual 2 or 3 or maybe 4-year research grants. If I'm going to advocate risk, with risk has to come the possibility of failure. And I would much rather see a portfolio of projects, some of which are quite risky, but where, if they work, you can see where the uptake's going to be. What worries me about impact is whose impact. So in a university, when I think about impact, frankly and honestly, is impact in the scientific literature, an impact that I can convince the grant givers of. And most of my academics think about impact basically in how many Nature papers or science papers or PNAS papers they get. If you think about impact as a patient, or as a patient representative, what I want to see is that there are insights that I can talk to my friends, my colleagues, my co-sufferers about, and see that there is hope that we are actually beginning to address the either underlying causes or amelioration of their disease, and that there is something down the line, perhaps for the next generation, will be better. And how do we bring these different visions of impact together in a sensible way and balance them? And I'm not sure any one person can do that. And so when I talk about impact, it is how we, and I've used this pronoun, I'm a stickler for pronouns. I've used this pronoun we repeatedly. I think this has to be a joint enterprise. So my concern about impact is it's often driven by the likes of my top research scientists who are interested in Nature papers or the science papers or the PLOS One papers, rather than those who will ultimately benefit from the eventual outcome. So I'm not underestimating time, but I am questioning whether there is that line of sight and that understanding for the actual eventual health outcome.
Iain, we have a web stream question, and it's on governance. So how do you allow disruptive innovation in large international public-private partnership consortia? Do the rather rigid structures not impact on creativity?
Well, I think the answer to the second one is yes. That's what I think I've been trying to say, that rigidity does impact on creativity. For me, you have to experiment. So to take an enterprise of the size of IMI and say, well, let's just throw the model away, let's reinvent the model, and let's do skunk works with everything that we do and be hugely creative on all of the 3.2 billion. That seems to me to be a facile thought. But I don't see why there shouldn't be a part of what IMI, for example, does, or the other entities do, that does actually say, okay, well, let's take a couple of health areas, of diseases, where actually we're really not getting very far. And let's just be very risky and very creative within that bound envelope. And the problem with risk is risk needs to be bound. And I think as long as there's clarity on how that risk is bound, then even very large, somewhat bureaucratic organizations, and IMI is actually very unbureaucratic by our European standards, but it still has checks and balances around it appropriately. Let's take a risk with some things. It's not for me to say what they are, but maybe some of the areas which are particularly sticky. Well, I'd rather risk $500 million than have nothing.
It's the first time I've heard anybody saying that IMI is not bureaucratic, but anyway. Thank you for that, Iain. So there's another one here. How can the IMI work best with EU research infrastructures to conceive project ideas that represent major bottlenecks in translational research?
Well, I think I partly just addressed that, actually. But again, let's pick up on this. It's the we thing again, it's the together. It's not just IMI working with EU research infrastructure, it's EU research infrastructure working with IMI. How is it? I don't know the answer to this, but Kurt's going to be up on the panel later, so pre-warned, Kurt. I don't know the answer to this because we obviously have to have very, very bureaucratic rules, because that's the nature of it, around how the EU research infrastructure spends an awful lot of money. But if I look within one country, we're doing it, and I can't see that the UK can do something that Europe can't do, and we're doing it again by identifying a number of priorities where we take a deliberate decision to say, okay, let's build infrastructure, let's create some themes which the UK Research Council is now all coming together as one with Innovate UK will focus in on, and create some real partnership around that. You can't do it with everything, but you can do it with some things. That's a test for you in your performance discussion next time round, Pierre.
We'll take one more question from, yes?
Thank you. First of all, I'm Annette Bakker from the Children's Tumor Foundation. I'm very impressed with IMI altogether. But my question is, so for the moment, IMI is majorly focused in the preclinical, in the pre-competitive space, right? Do you see in your dreams that there would ever be an IMI even in the competitive space? Or should that stay a dream?
Well, that's a good question. Well, I do dream, but that's not an anxiety dream. So I think the first thing to say is, I think for as an act of principle, personally, my own view would be, if you could make it work, why not? I think making it work could be extraordinarily hard. And we'd end up in a conversation, well, is there exceptionalism because of health need from a series of other principles in law that are enshrined across our society and our economy? And if I thought that there was a way we could make that work, then I would be an advocate for that. So it's a dream which is a wonderful dream. As I say, it doesn't give me anxiety. Unfortunately, I don't see it happening in my lifetime, which I hope, like our parents, has got a good few years in front of it, Pierre.
So maybe we could have a short answer to the very last question, which is on the screen. Don't you think that a first step to fully enable open innovation is to open access to scientific knowledge via fully implementing open access to publication?
I think the two things are mutually supportive and must go hand in hand.
Good, nice short answer.